recording and a transcript for this. So with that being said, good afternoon, community college family. It's good to have you here. If you are from the West and you're on the call, our hopes and our prayers go out to you. And if there's anything that you need, please let us know, and we will try our best to get that to you. We know that everyone in the West is having many in the West is having a really hard time right now. And as Jean said earlier, we're recording this, so if they could not make the call today, which we know that many cannot, that this will be available to them in the future, and also the rest of you also. But we just want to make sure that we provide ample recognition of what's going on in the West, and and provide you with our hopes and support and prayers to you all. With that being said, thank you for being on the call. This is the RDS Basics call. Many of you are probably first time users to RDS or admissions office registrars, depending on what school you attend, whether or not you're hearing this for the first time or not. I am going to turn everything over to Jean Ritter, and I'm going to put myself on mute. But just so you know, it is being recorded. If you are not on mute, please make sure that you're not having a lot of activity in the background. We want to make sure that everyone can hear what's being said and going on. If you have any questions, Jean, do you mind if they just stop you in the middle of your presentation to ask questions?
That's fine.
Okay, so if you have any questions, just stop Gene in his presentation and ask those questions. It'd be great. It'd be his pleasure to answer everything. And if you have any questions at the end, we'll provide time. And I also will be watching the chat. So if you have questions in the chat that you don't feel comfortable asking out loud, I will read them off for you. With that being said, I will turn it over to you, Gene.
Thanks, Monty. And yes, we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. Suggestions and so forth, discussion. Let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Just a second here. Okay, so thanks for joining us. Some of you I know, I recognize your names on there. You've been around this, we'll provide some review, and we will talk about recent legal changes in the last year or two, new provisions. For some of you, if you're new, welcome. What I'm trying to do here is give you an overview. Don't worry about taking a lot of notes because we're going to send these slides out. And I've got a lot of stuff on here because a lot of people use these, they tell me, as reference tools as they're going through doing their work. So I want to give a high-level overview, but also to give some suggestions or what we're finding. There are times when students kind of get tripped up in here. Usually it's a student error on their end, but we're going to give some suggestions of what we're seeing. But there will be plenty of time for discussion to talk about that. So if you're new to this, my name is Gene Ritter. I'm the Residency Program Manager at SEAA. SEAA is an affiliate agency under the UNC system that actually has the legislative authority and direction to operate this system, which is operated daily under contract to CFI. So that's kind of a long piece to it. But the legislature created, this system. We'll talk a little bit about that and its purpose and how it works. So going to talk about what are the basic legal requirements for a student to be considered eligible for in-state tuition. There's some misunderstanding about that from students, and that's part of the issue we have sometimes. What their experience looks like, determinations, how they're dated, how long they're effective. There are some tuition exceptions for someone who doesn't meet the criteria. We'll talk about that. Campus-based responsibilities, I'm going to give a high-level view. We're going to have later this month an advanced training for whoever in your campus is responsible for coding, running processes for continuous enrollment, coding campus exceptions and tracking them. So we'll have another one to go a deeper dive, but I'll talk basically about what's the role of the campus, some helpful hints of what we're seeing for students, and some recent legislative changes. So Basically, state law has been around and is pretty similar from state to state about eligibility to get a discounted tuition rate for in-state tuition. Has been around since the 70s. There's been very little change to it. There's been additions to exceptions for those who can't meet it, but there's been very little change. RDS is more recent because back in, I guess it was 2011, the legislature ordered one centralized service. Prior to that, the student had to fill out paperwork and submit documents if they were applying to 4 institutions, they had to go through it 4 times. They found there was a lot of inconsistency about how thorough. Some of them kind of went overboard, they felt, and others didn't really check. They just said, do you say you're a resident? Okay, it's good enough. One of the reasons they're so protective of this is, if you don't know, we have like the 2nd or 3rd lowest tuition rates in the entire country for in-state. So for example, if you're in-state resident in South Carolina and want to go to the community college there, your in-state rate is almost what our out-of-state rate is. So, you know, there's a lot of awareness about that, but they also were concerned because there was fraud. There was a third party that would charge people who lived out of state trying to get their son or daughter here. They would guarantee to find the loopholes to get them in. You might have to go somewhere for 1 semester and transfer. And it was a big business. And so when this went live, you know, it stopped because we validate with state agencies. Is the person really here, kind of thing. The student has just one determination then. And if they apply to 3 institutions or they transfer, they've got the one. They don't have to go through it again. So again, the statutory requirements set in by law are pretty solid and haven't really been changed at all since the 70s, but there are some provisions in there, some exceptions to give a tuition exception in some cases. So that's the background. These are the basic requirements. The person wanting to claim residency for tuition purposes has to have the legal capacity to establish a residence. And here the law talks about domicile. Basically, it's your primary permanent residence. We have a lot of folks who have vacation homes in North Carolina, and they try to use that to send someone here, you know, when they're living 11 months of the year out of state, and that's their vacation home. No, it's got to be their primary residence. You have to have the legal capacity. So to do that, typically you have to be 18. Okay, there's a couple exceptions out there to begin to establish one other than that of your parents. You also have to be a U.S. citizen or have an immigration status that doesn't prohibit you from establishing a permanent residence. You have to have the intent that it's your permanent home. And this is a big issue because we get a lot of students, especially coming here to a 4-year, and they say they live in a dorm their first year to 4-year, and they say, well, I've lived here for a year now. I should qualify. Well, no, a dorm's not a permanent residence, you know, and you have to be making changes, you know. So if you changed your license, if you've done all that, okay. Sometimes people come here to work for 6 months. You know, if you're not making changes to make it permanent, you may be physically living here, but it's not a permanent arrangement. And then the duration requirement is once you establish it, you have to hold it for a minimum of 12 months. And again, these are pretty typical from state to state. There's a couple states that actually has to be 24 months, two years, but it's pretty typical from state to state in terms of what the requirements are, because again, it's so heavily discounted compared to other states. The legislature's, you know, guarding that, but also it works with state grants. That grant money runs out, and in the past, it was one of the complaints of the legislature of, you know, I know people that are beating the system. They're not really residents and they're getting state grants and the money ran out. I've lived here my whole life. That's not fair. So it's also used for that purpose. A very important point here for younger students, so basically high school, is the law presumes that your permanent residence, your domicile is wherever your living parent or court-appointed legal guardian is, okay? You can ask to be considered as independent, but you again have to be 18 to begin to establish one separately if your parents are in another state, okay? But you also have to show financial independence. Again, this is probably our most frequent request for appeals of students who came here from out of state to go to a university, and after 1 year saying, I've been living here for a year, but they have no employment, no financial aid, and the parents are sending checks every month. Well, no, it's not about physical presence. It's about, you know, where are you domiciled? What's your permanent residence? Importantly, the student doesn't have to be living with the parent, because that's their argument. Like, well, they live in Virginia, but I'm living here now. No, you've got to make changes. You've got to be independent. You've got to make that change. So for other students that have reasons, we'll come back to this, that sometimes we hear in high school about, well, I don't get along with the parents, I don't live with them, although there are a sizable number that they'll send their son or daughter here to a high school their last, like semester of high school to try to get in state because they're targeting university. If the student's not living with the parent or guardian for whatever reason, that's okay. We just need to verify that the parent and guardian is here in North Carolina. We've had instances, for example, where the parent is incarcerated. Okay, well, we can look that up in a database, or if they give us parent information, their name, their date of birth, their address, we can usually look it up in a database. We just need to make sure, have they really been here? Are they really residents? Hear a lot of times from students, oh, I have a special situation or all this. These are all the types of, not all even, these are most of the frequent questions we get. And these are built into our sophisticated online system. So if they're a ward of the state in foster care, okay, well, if they submit a document or a letter from foster care saying, attesting to that, we don't look for parents. They're okay. We're going to approve them. Same thing if they're under 18, they're married, or they're truly orphaned. There's provisions for all of this. There's a provision if they've been living here long term, not just come for the last 6 or 12 months in high school with an adult, one or more adult relatives, like a grandmother or something like that. There's provisions for all of this. Again, the intent, in the laws is to screen that someone really is, a bona fide residence. We're going to talk about military affiliated families that are not residents in North Carolina, but they're here physically serving. There's provisions. So there's a lot of provisions built in, and all of them are built into our online system to get that information from the student. One of them is the student must provide evidence, or they must tell us they're a U.S. citizen or evidence of an eligible immigration status if they're a non-citizen. We do not check the status of a parent. There's a lot of rumors about that students get turned down because of the parent. No, but the student must, to get in-state tuition, must show an eligible status. And for those of you who work in like federal financial aid, there are a lot of, there's very few, there's only like one visa type they'll take. We have dozens that we will. It's a different definition that as long as the visa type doesn't say you may not, and a condition of granting it is you may not establish a permanent residence. Those are the ones we have to exclude. And they're like, but I've been here physically, well, I know, but your immigration says you're not allowed to consider a permanent residence. So those are the ones we exclude, and we keep up with that, and I update them regularly. These are the types of general categories. If they're a permanent resident, refugee, asylee, have what we call temporary protected status, and then the eligible non-immigrant visas. The RDS guidebook lists all of these in detail. I want to give a word of caution about the category of refugee. Under U.S. immigration law, it's a very narrowly defined category, but the media uses, the popular media talks about anybody kind of coming here saying, I don't feel safe in my country. This refers to how U.S. immigration classifies them. Okay? And that status is granted before they get here. You can't apply for it once you're here. Okay, so again, details are in there, but RDS screens for all of this for you. So one more word on immigration is some of the statuses are permanent, like permanent resident, even though their card may expire because they're trying to combat fraud. They keep changing the design. It's those top three have no expiration date. It's only the bottom two that have fixed expiration. And in some cases, they might not get renewed. For example, the visa, it depends on the type. For some of them accompanying a parent, they'll age out and they have no other recourse unless they could qualify for something else. They'll lose their status. So um, those we track, and we'll talk about that under tracking responsibilities. So active duty military, let's talk about this. So there's a provision in law, both federal and state, that because military get transferred very frequently, often, that it could be disruptive for someone trying to go to college, and then it's constantly moving. What we do with active duty military is we take the state that they're declaring on their records in the military. They're allowed to declare what they want to be their permanent residence. They have a choice. If they say North Carolina, they're good to go, even if they're not physically here now. If they say it's another state, but they're physically serving here, then we have a tuition exception where the service member and their family, spouse and dependent, as long as they're here, can get a tuition exception, all right? Because they're claiming another state, but because they're stationed here currently. Generally, if a student comes in with that, if they're declaring North Carolina, they're going to get in, they don't need an exception. These would be the ones who they're saying, I'm claiming another state as my permanent residence, but I'm serving here now. RDS would handle these. There's no other requirement other than showing orders that they're here. You don't have to worry about that. And generally, the student can keep that as long as they're continuously enrolled, and even if the service member gets transferred. Okay. So they don't have to use a benefit. Very different from the veterans. We're going to talk about that. That's a requirement to get the exception. So notice we give, you're always going to see 2 letters from RDS, in, out, or out in this case. They're an out-of-state resident because they're claiming another state. We're not saying they're residents, but they're eligible for in-state tuition. So this gets passed into your system and the billing's adjusted accordingly, okay? Important distinction, because separate laws govern who's eligible for a state grant. Those laws will not recognize exceptions, okay? So you might get a tuition exception, but you're not going to be eligible for a state grant unless you fully meet the residency criteria. So that's why we have 2 different ones, okay? Recently, there was a change in federal law that allowed the same tuition exception for active duty military for a very defined, narrow category of federal workers, U.S. Foreign Service. These are typically associated with consulates, embassies, mostly in other countries, but there are a couple of big offices here in DC, Northern Virginia, and Atlanta. In theory, I guess these days, someone could be assigned to work from home in North Carolina. They could get the same provision as active duty. There's a lot of misunderstandings. Some people think it's any federal employee. No, it even gives a section of law about you have to be under this particular program. Again, RDS is screening for all this. You don't need to worry about it. Big times there's a change in there. We build it in. We're not aware of a single person here. Will it ever happen? Maybe. As I say, this day of age, they might assign someone temporarily working in a military base. I don't know. But right now, it's 0. There's also provision for North Carolina National Guard members. These are the drilling folks that go like 1 weekend a month, and then they go for a week or 2 once a year. Almost all of them don't need an exception because they've been living here. They have full-time jobs. They've been living here in North Carolina. But there is an exception carved out, in this case for the guard member, but not the spouse or dependent. The most common instance, I think right now, we probably have about 12 active ones in the system that got the exception. And a lot of them are, for example, just across the border south of Charlotte in Rock Hill, there's a large Air National Guard unit at the Charlotte airport. There aren't a lot of those around, so some people affiliate there. Or somebody close to the border, like we have 1 or 2 from Northern Virginia, where I guess it's closer for them to affiliate North Carolina. So they're residing in the other state. That's their residence. But if they're members of this particular guard of the North Carolina, they're eligible for that out an exception. So most of them don't need an exception, and their contracts are very long-term. It's rare we have to give one, but just so you're aware. There's no provision in statute for any other type of reservist. This North Carolina National Guard is not a full-time active duty unless they're activated, but There's a lot of other reserves. You have Army, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard all here in North Carolina. There's no provision for them. Again, the idea is they're supposed to be here in the community long term for their contract, that eventually they'll qualify. But we screen for all this. We take care of that if they need an exception. So before I get into the student thing, let me pause there and see if there's any burning questions. Okay. So for all those things we've just talked about, RDS will do the screening, we'll take care of it. If they get the exception, in this case, for example, or the active duty military or National Guard or whatever, we'll flag it as out in and we'll put a code so that you know what the story is. Okay. If you're not familiar with the student's experience, I'm going to go through just a couple of things very briefly. It's an online process. And it works very much if you're familiar with any of the tax programs like Tax Act or TurboTax, that the student is going to get different questions in different orders depending on their situation. Some high school counselors said, well, what's wrong with the system? And some of them only got 5 questions and some of them got 30. I mean, it really depends on how they're answering it. First question is, are you trying to claim residency for tuition purposes? Because we get a lot of people from out of state applying. Or if someone knows they just moved here last month and they're not going to qualify now for the 12 months, they can say no, they're done. They get are you sure? If you meet it in the future, come back. And they're done. They have their number. That's it. It's going to depend on what their situation is. They're asked, are you a U.S. citizen? If no, it takes you to the immigration module. Do you have any of these statuses, kind of thing? Yes or no. If there's military involvement, it asks them that. If so, then it asks them, well, is it, is it a family member? Are they active duty? Are they reserve? And so forth. So it's pretty sophisticated. And then it's designed to give the most common things up front to help them get to a yes answer quickly. If they keep saying no, it's going to keep going through every possible scenario and exception that exists. Okay. So we're trying to, it might be longer for some because we're trying not to say no unless we've exhausted everything we can see. 99% of the students get a provisional decision right away and they're told it's subject to validation. And really that's done to accommodate community college students because having worked on campuses a number of years, I know how it is where students come in the first day classes. How do I apply for admission? How do I register? And how do I get financial aid? The electronic validation, which is done with the state agencies, typically happens overnight or by next business day. So, but it's not an immediate, we got to wait for their time to get the files back to us. So at least it gives them something to register with. Get a lot of questions about this. Students say, well, I don't know what to do or what's next or whatever. Well, there's contact information virtually on your screen, but they can always log into their account. And I'm going to show you the dashboard in a minute and see what the status is. Up front, only about 5% of students are asked to submit a document anymore. And part of the system was we're trying to make this more secure to not send a lot of stuff back and forth. So if they say that their parents, have a driver's license, file taxes, or employed, registered to vote, or has Medicaid or something like that, it pings those agencies and they say yes or no, So most of it's electronic. The only things we don't do electronically are ones we can't, verify. Like we need to see military orders. We need to see the immigration status. Other than that, if it's a court order, other than that, we don't ask for it up front. Now, if they get to an appeal and they say that state's wrong or something's different or I have a weird situation, yes, they're welcome to submit more. But up front, very few students need to submit a document. Again, I want to stress tuition exceptions don't make them a resident. So they may be getting in-state tuition like a resident, but they could always come back if they think they now meet the full residency criteria. The student has to have an active determination on the first day of their enrollment. Once they're enrolled, they're generally good to go and don't need to come back for most cases. Look at that. So it's, and then most of them are getting extended now through a process we're doing. Just so you know what kinds of information, this is one of the many tools we have on the public website, mostly for like counselors and parents, here's what you're going to need to fill out the FAFSA, what kind of information, here's what you need for residency. And you'll see it's pretty similar. We do ask more information about immigration if they're wanting to claim in-state status about the student. We might ask about state taxes if there's a question of the parents having two states because they have to indicate on state taxes which is their primary state. Are they saying it's North Carolina? Are they saying it's another state? So sometimes that helps us do that, but it's pretty similar information. This is the dashboard I was talking about. I know this is hard to read in a small thing, but students can always log into their account and see have they been validated, are they getting in-state tuition or an exception. That blue text box will turn to red. You'll see a tile on the left if they owe documents saying you've not submitted documents. Here's your deadline. And it tells them what they need. We haven't gotten a copy of the military order. We haven't gotten a copy of your immigration visa. Again, they can always call in the call center and ask these questions. I don't know what to do next or whatever. If they disagree with it or they come back later for a reconsideration, there's a button they click and it walks them through the difference of a reconsideration or an appeal. Reconsideration is basically if they have to correct something or have new information, update something, something's changed. Maybe they weren't here 12 months and now it's 6 months later and they have been and they could qualify. They're better off doing that because it might happen electronically. In the initial consideration, I'd probably say about 87% pass behind the scenes. We never have to touch them. The agencies say, yes, everything matches, they're good to go. It's when there's another state in the picture or we can't document they've been here 12 months or some unusual situation, or we have to look at a document that, it requires human touch. The effective dates, we use the date that they submit. So if a student submits a request today, that's the date we use to check eligibility. We don't check a year ago. We don't check, will they meet it in 9 months because something could change. And that's what we use the effective date. So let's say a student submits today, they need to submit a document, but we don't get the document for 20 days, okay? We'll still use this effective date. Or if they appeal a decision, we'll use the effective date from the decision they're appealing. With few exceptions, they've got 15 months to enroll. And that was set, by advisory teams because we know because we've had phone calls from parents saying, like the students in their junior year, they want to go ahead and do it because they know they're planning on moving out of state when the student graduates high school. Well, around 12 months with the 15, it was extended to 15 because if a student does this in the fall of their senior year, but they don't enroll in the fall term, but they defer for one term in the spring, it would still let them pass. But if it's beyond that, they need a new one. If the student presents a new determination after start of term, so let's say the student starts the term with an out-of-state determination, maybe they didn't meet the requirements, and they come through today and they got in-state, we're going to date it today. If the term's already in progress, it's institutional policy of whether it's effective the same term or the next. It doesn't go back to a year ago if the student never came through. So, but in terms of a term that's currently in progress. Most students don't need to get a new determination. It's just if they stop out for a year or they graduate and later come back or they transfer institutions, we need to see an active one. Now, if they've been attending anywhere in North Carolina, we run a process twice a year by comparing records that you all submit to the National Student Clearinghouse. If they're showing as enrolled anywhere in North Carolina, we're extending that expiration date by a year. We do that at the end of fall, the end of spring semesters. The exceptions are if a student has like one of those out-in determinations, it's an exception, or if a student has a visa that's expiring, we don't automatically extend them. We'd have to look at it at the time. You can always, if you feel it's desirable, request the student come back for a new one. And some people do this rather than dealing with expiring immigration status and prefer RDS does it. And we'll talk about that later about the campus responsibility, but you can. Student can always return for a reconsideration. There's a time limit on appeal that if they're saying this determination is wrong, you can't come back 9 months later and want it backdated. You've got a time limit to do an appeal, but they can always come back for a reconsideration and provide the information or additional information. I want to point out, because we sometimes get questions on these items, there's many similarities in qualifying through FAFSA for federal financial aid, but there's some differences here. Okay. It's, for example, in the immigration categories for the student, same thing. They never ask about the status of a parent, but for the student, it's basically those permanent ones. Are you a permanent resident, asylee, refugee? There's really only one visa type they're taking, T. We have dozens of them we will take. So they might be eligible for in-state tuition and not for federal aid, or state, because the state requires you have to be eligible under Title IV for federal. So, but there are one or two cases now recently that they've passed that they'll make someone eligible for aid, even if they might not meet residency requirements. So that gets a little confusing. We're aware of it, but that's the statute. So for example, they recently carved out something specific to people who have arrived recently from Ukraine or Afghanistan, but who don't hold like a refugee or other status. They have what we call a parole that U.S. immigration site says that, they don't have the ability, they're not admitted under law, they're just here temporarily for a year. So they can't, by their own law, they can't meet it, but they're willing to give some federal financial aid, even if they have to pay out of state. So there is a disconnect. It's not necessarily an error, but just you've got different laws there. Finally, I want to mention about high school counselors will sometimes bring up about students designated under McKinney-Vento Act, if you're aware of that. So basically, there's federal statute that talks about students who they classify as homeless or unaccompanied. And there's certain privileges and certain perks that they get and certain things that they can and can't do in the school. And one of them is that, then basically they're not to ask about parent information. Their definitions, for example, of unaccompanied is these includes the student is not living under the same roof as the parent. So in theory, somebody who's been living with the grandparent long-term and the parent literally living next door, which we've seen, they consider homeless and unaccompanied. Because our laws don't require they're under the same roof. As long as we see the parent, if they've been long-term with the grandparent, we'll go that right. If it's short-term, if we can verify that parent's somewhere in North Carolina, they're good to go. So we have to qualify them in a different way. They're used to saying, oh, under law, they have to have anything they need. Well, K through 12, but it doesn't extend to this. But if we know the situation, it is very rare we cannot approve them. It only happens in cases like they literally just moved here, their last year of high school, or they don't have an immigration status. Again, doesn't mean they can't attend college, but for our purposes, there's an issue. And we'll come back to exceptions in a bit. So these are things I want to point out because we get a lot of questions on these. Yes, they might qualify for federal financial aid, but not residency. You could have that with U.S. citizens. You could qualify for federal financial aid, but then the parent moves here yesterday. They're not going to meet requirements here for, in state yet. So they're two separate things. On the other hand, here's where in North Carolina, we're able to approve students with dozens of different visa types that they won't accept. Okay. In terms of issues of students, we kept hearing about, oh, the system's whatever, like, oh, the system put this student out because, they've been here their whole life. We did an analysis about a year and a half ago of everyone who got out of state on their first attempt, okay? And we found these were the issues. And those top four, the number one by far is an incorrect social or date of birth for themselves and or parents. They asked for that to be keyed in twice and it's got a match. So they've keyed it in the same way wrong twice. In hearing from some of your campuses, I've heard that, the frustration of it's also happening on the application for admission, and it's also happening on FAFSA at times. FAFSA eventually, as do we, go to try to verify that, but it's not upfront. We're taking that at face value and see if we can match the records. In terms of students coming back for reconsideration, I'd say probably 80% or more of the reconsiderations is one of these top issues. And when we correct it, then they pass. So we keep trying to. I just had another training for high school counselors this week. I did. Please have them slow down and verify it. That's the number one issue. And then they're like, oh, the system's broken because they've been here their whole life and it's not letting them in. Next, is skipping too many questions. They're like, well, you have my name and address. That's enough. And they say no to everything. So we have to take that at face value, that you or anyone in your family has no license, vehicle registration, voter, is not employed, not filing taxes, no Medicaid, no food stamps, no nothing. So we have to take that as, well, maybe you just moved here yesterday. And then they come back and give us the information they pass. So just so you know. The other issue with younger students is they say, I don't want to give you parent information. Some have told us that they're trying to get a dependency override and they don't want the parent to be considered in terms of, possible financial aid benefit. But the law says until they can show they're independent financially, we need the parent information. They can try. If they don't pass, they get a warning saying it doesn't look like you're reporting you have no income. It doesn't look like you're going to pass. We need your parent information. Do you wish to provide that? They have to say, no, I don't. And then they'll get out of state. Unless they have one of those exceptions where we don't have to look at that. But these are the top reasons. And then others below that is a smaller percentage. So that's the biggest issue we see. We keep trying to stress that. So just if you do work directly with students, a couple of things we're seeing, we recommend, again, if they're dependent, put information with the parent. Some of them try to put down, well, my neighbor will vouch for me, or I live with a boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, and they have no income, or, again, if we know the name, address, date of birth, social would be great, but we can often do manual lookup in databases and verify the parents here. Done. Again, they don't have to be living with the parent. Again, they've got to have an eligible immigration status. We get a lot that, the status prohibits it. We had someone that contacted a legislator. Well, the parent has a temporary visa that's good for 4 months, and it says you may not establish a residence here. They're here temporarily for a job. And the student, can be here with them, but is not allowed to work. So, I mean, it says the visa says you may not. So we can't say that you're eligible to establish a permanent resident. Again, there's a lot of rumors about this. Sometimes, what we hear is high school counselors say, oh, students are getting out because you're putting them out because of the parent not having a status. We never asked that question. We wouldn't know. And every time I said, give me an example, and they do, it was another reason. The student gave wrong information or, something. But we don't, we just have to verify the parents physically here. So if a student gets an out-of-state, here are the different options we have. Is, again, a reconsideration appeal. The system walks them through, and they can always call the call center anytime they're in the middle of an application or after, or have questions, and say, I don't know how to answer this, but the system walks them through the difference. Basically is, if they have the correct information, have new information, have updates, it's better to do the reconsideration because they might pass electronically. It's faster. If they say, I don't have anything new, I think you got it wrong, I can disprove what the state agencies are saying, I have paperwork or I have unique circumstance, then they can do an appeal. They do a shorter statement, and that's it. They don't go through a whole interview. And then, they'll be assigned to a worker who works with them one-on-one. They can eventually talk to a committee. And they get very detailed information about those. So that may be the way to go. But if they have just to update information, it's probably faster to do the other, quite honestly. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, with the college university, about possible tuition-based exceptions. And then finally, if applicable, we have a final level of appeal that comes to us here at SAE. It's administrative, and basically the only grounds for appeal is you felt that the RDS made the wrong decision. You have to make an argument. In the last year, I think all but one of them, I don't think any were from a community college. I think all but one were students who came here to go to a 4-year and they're trying to argue about, I've been here physically 12 months. What difference does it make? I think I don't agree with the law. So we get very few of appeals at that level. So, I mean, usually it's resolved, on the RDS side with an appeal, but the ones we do get are just, there's just not a chance in law. So what are the options if they can't meet the legal requirements? We have campus-based exceptions, okay? A big one that is common, most of these are by sector, but one that applies to every sector is non-resident students who have and use a VA educational benefit are entitled to a tuition adjustment. So scenario, yeah.
Before you get too far into that, I had two questions. You got two
Yeah.
questions.
Okay.
One says, does the student have to complete the application in one sitting, or can they save and come back to it later?
Yeah, they can save and come back. They can save and come back 2 or 3 times. Now, there's a limit of, I think it's 25 days to keep saving it. Then it's going to, and it sends them 3 or 4 email reminders. Whenever there's a deadline for that or a document, they get 3 or 4 email reminders. They can opt into text as well. But yes, they can always save. In fact, we tell them save and come back rather than making up information, or you don't have it right now.
Yeah. Second question is, what happens if a student is a high school student and U.S. citizen and the parent is undocumented and have not filed taxes or have a North Carolina ID?
Okay. Well, again, we do not ask about the status of a parent. What the student will indicate is there's a thing in there saying, my parent doesn't have or doesn't wish to provide a social or other information. Okay. They check that. Okay. We still need the name and address of the parent. And depending on the scenario, sometimes we get at least partial information, but basically they're probably going to end up in an appeal. Maybe a reconsideration could be done. Sometimes these folks have an ITIN and file state taxes. Sometimes they have a vehicle registration. But it also applies to people that we have some people that, let's say everyone's a US citizen, but the parents are just guarded saying, I don't want to give you my social. I'm concerned about privacy. Well, we have a procedure where, can you give us and we'll give them choices. Can you give us the following documents? You can redact your social if you wish. We need to see your name and address and tie it to North Carolina. So yeah, I mean that, but somehow the rumors out there that that students who have parents that are undocumented, again, we would never know because we never ask. So we're not turning them down. But if they need assistance with an alternate way to document that, yes, by all means, we can do that. Hopefully that helps.
That's it. So I guess going forward.
Let me go on, then we have more time for questions. So we're talking about for veterans educational benefits. So let's say the person was just recently discharged or the son or daughter wants to come here to go to school. Okay, there's a procedure, but this is one that has to be done at the campus because there are other requirements that have to be, monitored. You don't just get an exception because someone was a veteran. It's if you have and use the educational financial benefit. So the tuition exception has to be applied at the campus level if they're awarded and use it. We've had some say, I don't want to use it now. It's a limited amount. I'm going to save it for later in my career when the tuition's more expensive. They can do that, but they can't get a waiver until they can meet residency criteria. And again, if the veteran fully meets criteria and gets in, we don't need an exception and you can apply the financial aid. This is just if they're asking for the tuition exception because we've determined they're a non-resident at this time. You can only grant it for any term that the tuition benefit is awarded. And there's a whole procedure on all that. And so we're going to spend a lot more time on that in the other session. And it's, in the campus manual we'll talk about.
Okay. So that's why that one has to be handled by the campus, because we don't know, the service member has to assign a benefit to spouse and dependents. They can divide it up. They can give it all to one person. They cannot give it to anyone. We don't know, or we don't know if the students used it. But the VA requires that they have that to get the exception, tuition exception. So that's why that one has to be used at the campus. And I keep stressing they've got to award and use it. So we've had campuses say, well, they've used it in 2 years and they've used it up, and now they're going to go out of the state and they're upset. Well, they, in theory, they're supposed to sign a statement they're working toward residency. Okay, so I mean, it's just, that's the way the law is. And the VA says, and they're the ones that define this, it's using the benefit that triggers the exception. There are several others that are by sector. The UNC system has 2. They're very narrow. Community colleges have more. Each one of these is very different. I'm going to give you a very high overview because these are the things we're going to go into more detail in the advanced session. So here are the ones carved into a different section of law actually pertaining to community colleges. Just quick overview. I'm not going to go through all the details, but business sponsored is designed that when you have a North Carolina employer sending a student saying, this is one of my employees and I'm sending them for training, if they pay directly to the college all expenses, then you adjust the tuition for that term. The student's still out of state, but you can adjust the tuition, but only for the terms that this happens. So if they do it one term, it doesn't give them an exception the rest of their career. They're going to have to qualify like everyone else. The next one, this one gets trickier. I wouldn't use it for military per se, but a civilian working for the military. This provision says that if someone was already working for an employer in another state, and that employer transfers them to North Carolina, where they have an office here, that you may be able to give a tuition exception for that year to meet duration. But this one has a cap. It cannot exceed more than, I think it's what, 1% of your out-of-state enrollment. So again, these get really complicated, and the spirit of these is it's meant to be temporary. So that's why these have to be handled at the campus, because we don't know how many you have or how long they've done and things like that. Next one is misunderstood a lot. Students sponsored by a nonprofit entity. We've gotten a lot of questions about, can you use that for students with no immigration status or something? And the answer is no. And these are defined by the community college system, and the general counsel there in the past to review all this. And all the rules are in the campus guide we're going to go over in the next session. They had to have been lawfully admitted. Because it says they have to be, it's a long, complicated thing. So this one is not used very often. The next one also is not used very often. It's for refugee. Now, we will take at RDS a refugee status, okay? The difference here is, again, about duration. If they're truly classified that way with that designation by U.S. Immigration, which is not a lot these days, you can give them a tuition adjustment. The only time you would need that, because it is eligible for us, is if they've been here less than a year. But that's a possibility. Okay, while they're meeting duration, let's say they moved to North Carolina a month ago, haven't been here for a year, but legally they can establish, you could do that for the 1 year. Certain U.S. non-citizen public high school graduates. This one is restricted also about immigration status. Now, they could have had one and it expired. They don't have one right now. They're trying to get it renewed, but they had to have been lawfully admitted. So would not apply to like DACA, would not apply to people applying for asylum unless they could show they used to have another status before that. So some restrictions, but it's a possibility to look into that. And my suggestion with these is, if you need help, give a call, look at them one-on-one, because these get really complicated. Pull out the other campus guide that goes through these with all the rules, because you're responsible for documenting and keeping track of that. There's also one for a non-U.S. citizen with a pending application for immigration or immigrant status. That is a permanent resident status specifically. Again, RDS will take that applications once it's approved. Once it's approved, sometimes it can be months before they get their physical card. They've got to go in for biometrics and get appointments, but we'll take that provisional approval. This is saying they filed it, they got back an acknowledgement of, we filed it, we'll get back to you on the approval. So you might have a few months in there where you could give that if they show they filed it. And again, these get very complicated with all the forms and aspects. My suggestion is consult when you got one of these. Federal law enforcement officers, there's some provisions, again, if they're taking certain courses for their, laws and whatnot. Not common, but again, I just give you a high level overview here to get through the other material. And if it's a U.S. citizen, this is one more recent one, who graduated from a public high school, it's possible to give them a tuition exception for 12 months following the day of their graduation. And again, the legislature looked at this about, because some of them were saying, well, my parents don't want to give me information. And, sometimes it's probably true, but we can do a lot of database lookups. And sometimes they're really from another state saying, well, I didn't get along with this, so I came to North Carolina. I want to go to college here. So, are they trying to beat the system? I don't know. But it gives them 12 months from the date of their graduation. So if they come to you 3 months, or like spring semester, and they graduate before, they might get the 1 semester out of it. That's it. But the idea is then they should be trying to qualify. In addition, the community college system decided they would recognize one of the 2 UNC exceptions because it didn't restrict them to do so. And you've got to follow the laws pertaining to how UNC defines it. If it's a full-time UNC employee of their family who qualifies for residency but hasn't met duration, and there's a whole procedure how that has to get validated with their IT. A lot of students try to use this even on the UNC side. I'm a work study. No, it's got to be a full-time permanent employee. Example, someone's hired as a professor. They move here August 1st. It's a permanent full-time position. It can't be temporary. It can't be any of these like affiliated UNC health clinics, things like that. It's really tightly defined, and it helps them that first year with duration. Most of these are meant to be very short term. So those are things that would have to be handled at the campus level. So again, I would say research each one. Don't try to remember all this because, they're all but 1 or 2 of them are pretty rare for most of you. And so when you have those campus things, then you need to collect documentation. Otherwise, there's no need. Anything that RDS collects, you don't need to collect the same documentation unless you need it for another reason, because we've got it on file. A lot of it's electronic. But if it's an exception you're making, then you want to document that of why that out-of-state student was given in-state tuition. Students can always return if at some point they think they can meet the residency requirement, and that eliminates you having to do exceptions and track them. So they can always come back. Like if they haven't been here 12 months and 3 months from now they have, great, have them come back. There's also provision, what we call a statutory grace period that the campuses handle. And this is if the student is already enrolled and attending, they're getting in-state tuition, can't be an exception, can't be out in or any exception you do. They got in, and they're telling you that they have moved, they're moving, the parents moved out of state, can I just do online? And you become aware of it. We can put them on a grace period. You've got to work with RDS that would extend that for 12 months from the date of the change. So let's say they tell you my parents moved September 1st, then that's the start of the grace period. And I want to just switch to online. Okay. So they would have that grace period, but it's important to follow the procedures in the campus manual to notify RDS, because the grant system will not accept any exceptions under their law, and they're going to come back to you to go after the student to get the money back once it's past a certain date in the term. Okay, you don't want to have to get into that. Plus, if they we've had some try to enroll somewhere else, thinking, well, I've got the in-state now, no one's going to know. Once we flag it as a grace period, we tell other institutions, hey, don't admit this student now unless they come back because it looks like they're out of state. So there is a provision there to help that student with a transition to decide either to try to meet criteria on their own if they were dependent on the parent, or prepare to pay out of state to continue, or to enroll in another state where they meet residency. It gives them some options. Okay, very quickly, campus-based responsibilities. Just high-level view, because this is what we're going to go into more detail on in the next session. Is, if you have troubleshooting or verifying something in colleague, that isn't quite working with the billing, you've got to have the support for an in-state rate or the exceptions you're coding. Managing and tracking the campus-based tuition exceptions. There's flags, there's codes, there's, you've got to end date them, you've got to track them, for those that require like every semester for an award or things like that. The other one we pass on is in that immigration category where they're time limited. We track and we send a code with anything that needs to be tracked of non-immigrant that needs to be tracked. It's just for temporary protected and certain visa types. And then there's procedures of, you could either collect documentation of it. If they had it in and they don't have a renewal yet, you could put them on a grace period. You could send them back to RDS and we can handle it and we can update them. Where we have to be careful is there are some visa types that the student will not be renewed unless they qualify for a different one because it's tied to the parent. And some of them end at like age 21, or if they marry, they cease to be eligible. We've seen some students have to switch to an F1 visa, international student, which is not eligible. The immigration says you're not allowed to be considered a resident. So anyway, we'll go into more detail about that and how to run reports and do that. And then again, any grace period provisions, we don't get a lot of those, but there's a way to coordinate that with RDS and not put another institution in a situation of admitting them and then later finding out, or not having to go after the student to collect grant monies that, should have been flagged as a grace period. So we'll go into more details on that in the next session. Some changes over the last year or two. So I added a number of new qualifying visa types into the RDS guidebook. And again, consulting with immigration attorneys we have here at the system office. As long as the visa says you may not, we're taking a broad view and allowing them to, be considered a resident for tuition purposes. And say in that way, a lot more students included that can get federal financial aid. We mentioned this, but the federal law and now the state law this session, we aligned it where if they're a U.S. Foreign Service worker assigned to duty in North Carolina, we give them that exception like the military. Again, right now, not aware of any of them. Okay. And finally, most recently, there is a provision that was passed about, there's 3 island nations that are called the freely associated states, okay? There was a compact made with them a number of years back. I became aware of it. We are already giving them in-state tuition eligibility. So again, this would be an exception if they can't meet it. I ran a report. I think we came up with 30 students ever that we processed, and all but 2 of them we gave in-state to. This would be someone who, let's say, doesn't have duration. Okay, they just moved here. They can get that out in kind of thing. Right now, we're still setting up the mechanisms. This is a complex coding thing. There's only one pending one, and I've already contacted the college about that one that we're aware of. We're watching in the meantime, and we're going to code them. By the way, those are 3, they used to be former U.S. territories in the Pacific, and this was part of the agreement granting them independence. But most students are going to be able to meet criteria. But if you have any of these things, these rare circumstances, give a call. We'll work that out with you and figure out what we need to do. Okay, so those were the recent changes in the past couple of years. Not anything sweeping that's going to affect a lot of students, but anytime we're aware of anything, we try to stay on top of it. If you're not aware, the public website has our official RDS guidebook. That is a public document. Everyone can see it. There's a lot of helpful hints and FAQs and handouts for parents and counselors and so forth on there, and students. But that walks you through all the things. This is kind of the Bible, if you will, of our processing team, and everything is cross-referenced with the legal references on there. It lists every detail you want to know, probably, and then like every single immigration status and all that. There's another document we're going to go into more detail in the next session, and it's a campus responsibility guide for those things you need to track and the things you need to handle, those campus exceptions, the few students that need tracking, how to handle them, what's required, how often do you have to track it, what documents do you need to keep. That I'm going to revise at some point. I've been waiting because there was something else pending, but I think we're okay. I'll get it done the next few months, but very few changes, as you see in the last couple of years. So we'll go into more detail on that. That is for campus use because it's behind the scenes and knowing what your exceptions are and options are and how to track. But the other one's a public book, and the students and parents and everybody can see that. Students can always call our call center, and there's a public website, there's the number, there's an email. It's like, well, student doesn't know what to do or doesn't know how to answer this question. Pick up the phone. They don't know what the next step is or what the issue is. Have them pick up the phone. They can give a third-party release to talk to someone else. They can do it verbally. They can do it online, electronically, but that's why they're there. Okay, so there's a lot of good information on the public website. Students, and like the question about what happens if my parents don't have certain documents or don't have a social, there's a handout on that for parents who don't have or don't wish to provide certain information. Walks them through screenshot by screenshot. It's a lot of information out there. A lot of them are translated into Spanish as well. The campus support line is truly just for you all. Please don't give the number out. These questions go to the team that does the processing and appeals. Okay, but we want you to be able to get through, especially if you've got some urgent or a student sitting in front of you, or an urgent question you're trying to register a student. The other line is pretty accessible. I mean, in the key busy periods, a week or two before classes start, especially in the fall, there could be a slight wait, but the student gets an option. It might be a 10-minute wait, and they could hit a button and they're next in line, and they'll get a call back rather than staying on the line. They have a choice. There's also on the public website repository there with that campus guide and other information. There's the username for that. But here's where you call if you have general questions and need to check on a process thing or troubleshooting. My contact information is, and my role is here again for campuses, is the fishery policy guidance. I mean, that's kind of my daily role, including with the RDS team. They have unusual circumstances, or probably about half of what I do is the complicated immigration system we have, trying to help them with that, about what to look for, what the stuff means. Publish the official guidebook and campus guide. And if it's a campus-based exception or tracking responsibilities or troubleshooting in your system, trying to figure out is the issue at your end or our end, probably they're going to send you to me with any of those questions. So that's my contact information. And then finally, a slide, just the next session. Invitations out there, but this is what we're going to focus in on, as I say, whoever is responsible for, those types of process or running the continuous enrollment feature at your end. And, I'll talk about where to find the documents published by the system office. For all of that, there's several documents pertaining to RDS functions within Colleague. Okay, I know that's a lot of information. Thanks for hanging in there. I'm going to go ahead and we will send these out, but now we'll open up the questions.
Are there any questions? I just think they're so thoroughly informed today. They have no questions.
Or thoroughly scared off or overwhelmed. I don't know.
Yeah, that too.
I know there's a lot, folks.
It's
I think the biggest guidance I have is, when you get these one-off or unusual things, give a call and we'll figure it out. Because some of these things are so uncommon. You might run it across once a year or two. It's hard to remember all that stuff. And then, things change. So
Melissa Beatty says they're waiting for the next session. So that's what we got. The next week is the liaison call.
Right.
And then the week after that is the session. So that'd be great.
Right. Yeah, and we'll talk about this in liaison call, but we are actually, I talked to the staff yesterday about if we have anyone right now in the system on a reconsideration or appeal, who like has a pending document or something, and we see that they're living in the affected area in the western part of the state, go ahead and extend it for a while. I mean, typically we enforce, there's deadlines about how many days and like 25 days for this and that. But if you see that and can catch it, great. If the student calls and said, I don't know when I can get back home to get this document, we can put a note in there and hold it open. Now, we don't want to do that for 9 months, but at that point we'd say come back as it looks like they might have to relocate or something. But, we're trying to make every effort and be flexible. Likewise, in the past, we've had storms like hit the East Coast and people had to temporarily evacuate and even live across the border in another state. I mean, we take all that into consideration so long as, they eventually return or they're not changing everything permanently to another state. Yes, there's flexibility there. If we know what's going on, the more flexible we can be. So if you hear anything from a student, have them call and tell us what the situation is, and we can flag the record that they won't get closed.
That is all the questions.
Really?
Yeah, no more
Okay.
questions in the chat. Just Hillary saying that your staff is wonderful, very resourceful. So,
Great.
other than that, no. Well, what I'll do now is I will stop recording in case people have questions there they don't want to ask while recording. So, recording has now stopped.